It's a great pleasure to be talking to you and a great honor to be talking to you. I have been given the challenge of telling you a little bit about the subject of my life, really, the last half century of my work in academia on the Supreme Court. And I'm going to begin with a short story of my mentor who took me aside when I graduated from graduate school and said, I just had a little thought for you. Do you know the Chinese axiom, may you live in interesting times? And I said that I did. And he said, well, I'm going to change it to may you teach in interesting times, because through my career, the court was very boring, not much happened, but I hope it's more interesting for you. I somehow don't think this moment in history is what he was thinking of. And so I want to try and describe for you, many of you are in K through 8, how easy it is maybe to get even younger students to understand what the Supreme Court is and how you might help them to understand it. But what I want to talk about is the same subject of what you can see tonight on PBS on Frontline. If you have the opportunity to watch Frontline and watch an episode that's going to be airing tonight called Supreme Revenge, The Battle for the Court. And it's about Mitch McConnell and how he tried to change the composition, not just of the Supreme Court, but of the federal courts in reaction to what he thought had happened to Judge Robert Bork back in 1987. And it is said in this episode that he called up President Trump on the night that Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away and said, you need to make an appointment immediately, and you need that appointment to be Amy Coney Barrett. And so I want you to understand how this one appointment is going to force me to do what I've had to do the last 2 semesters in a row, scrap everything I used to do in this course and try to figure out on the fly what is going on. The easiest way to understand the court is to understand that you are dealing with 9 lawyers who've become judges, who are now somewhat politicized and are sometimes functioning more as political justices. If you understand that really the math is only how do you get to 5? How do you get 5 justices who will be able to vote for a case to be able to control the majority? Then you are able to really teach what is going on in the court. The math is simple. The law is much more difficult. Used to be, we would teach about justices by saying you have to look and see whether they're willing to use their power or whether they're not willing to use their power. Whether they are activists, reach out, take cases, decide cases, do this on their own rather than what the legislature is doing, or whether they are willing to step back, defer to the legislature, let the political branches make the changes, and they interpret the law. But things have changed since then. So we no longer look at whether or not a justice is an activist or whether he's a self-restraint, or whether she is a liberal, or whether she is a conservative. We also look at the way they do their job. Are they historians or are they political philosophers? If they are historians, maybe they decide using a theory called originalism. I'm going to go back to when the framers created the Bill of Rights or when the framers created the Constitution. And I'm going to ask, what did the people in that time period, in that founding era from 1787 to 1791, understand those words to mean? It's a combination of using old dictionaries and using old linguistic analysis to try to figure out what the words meant at the time of the creation of those documents, and then look at the general history of what was the original public understanding or public meaning of those words. What did the people in the ratifying conventions in Independence Hall in Philadelphia or around the country, what did they understand those words to mean? And in a sense, these historical justices take us in a time machine back to that earlier era and try to figure out how to apply those lessons to today's issues. But in opposition to them, there are groups of justices called living, evolving constitutionalists. These are justices who look beyond that framing period to what have generations of justices decided in later cases called precedents, And how do I follow those precedents? How do I observe the Latin phrase stare decisis, let the decision stand? And so a justice might look not at what was the original meaning of the Constitution. They might look at what did this case in the First Amendment say in 1919? Well, the difficulty here is not all people from certain ideological dimensions follow the same approach. And so what I want you to see when I'm done is that when you look at the current court, you seem to have a greater majority of conservatives than we have seen since the 1930s. And you may be looking at one of the most conservative courts since the turn of the 20th century. That's how much change has happened. But when you look at those 6 justices on the conservative side, they may not agree with each other. Some of them are originalists. Clarence Thomas, Brett Kavanaugh, Neil Gorsuch, Amy Coney Barrett. They are originalists. They take a historical approach. They are textualists, some of them. Neil Gorsuch will look at his dictionary and say, what do the words in this law mean? What do the words in this constitutional provision mean? But some of them use a more establishment kind of conservative approach. Samuel Alito and John Roberts, who don't necessarily agree on how conservative they should be on the court. And so we may be looking at a court that will become fractured more than just liberal justices versus conservative justices. We may be looking at a court that will become fractured with liberal justices, some conservative justices who will be a bit more moderate because of their approach, and some conservative justices who will be more conservative in their approach. Now, how has this happened? The second thing you need to understand about this court is that it has not been in Democratic control since the 1960s. The last time that the Democrats had a majority of Democratic president-appointed justices controlling the court was in the Warren Court in 1968. Since 1969, there have been 20 appointments to the Supreme Court. 16 of them have been by Republican presidents. That means that the Republican presidential control has gone back more than 50 years. Now, that will explain to you what happened in 2016. In 2016, the conservative leader of the court, Antonin Scalia, suddenly passed away in February of 2016. Barack Obama had been holding back a justice who he thought could be confirmed even by a Republican-dominated Senate. His name was Merrick Garland. He was the chief judge of the District of Columbia Court of Appeals. In many ways, Garland was acceptable as much by the conservatives as he was by the liberals. And Obama had every reason to believe that he would be confirmed. But instead, Mitch McConnell, the majority leader of the Senate, decided, I'm just going to keep the seat open. We're not even going to have a hearing on Merrick Garland. Many of those conservative Republicans wouldn't even meet with Merrick Garland. And essentially what McConnell and the Republicans in the Senate did was take away about 9 or 10 months of President Obama's power as president to at least nominate somebody and have that person be considered for a replacement on the court. Now, why did McConnell do it? McConnell's gamble was maybe if we can hold out till the 2016 November election, maybe the Republican will win. Maybe we can hand that seat to the Republican to fill. And maybe we can prevent the Democrats from taking control of the court for the first time since 1968, because that's what would have happened if Merrick Garland, a nominal liberal, had replaced Antonin Scalia, a very ultra-conservative. And so Garland's seat was kept open. And in doing that, what McConnell did, and I'm sure you will see this in the PBS series, he politicized the court. And he did it, I guess what they're saying is, in reaction to the Democrats holding up and denial of Robert Bork his seat on the court in 1987. But what he also did by doing this was ensure that that political effort to change the direction of the court was going to continue. The Democrats weren't going to forget this. And so Since that time, there have been considerable changes on the court, but they've all been coming from the Republican side. In order to get Neil Gorsuch confirmed on the court, what the Republicans did is they eliminated the filibuster for Supreme Court nominations. Now, their excuse was that Harry Reid had done this for the lower federal court nominations. That is true. And Harry Reid did that, engineered a change in the rules so that you eliminated the filibuster and made it possible for Barack Obama to fill those seats because Mitch McConnell was preventing anybody from getting appointed to the court. It was the only way Barack Obama could fill the seats that he filled. And as it was, there were nearly 100 seats that were left open because there was not enough time, and Mitch McConnell was not going to let those people be confirmed. So when Neil Gorsuch was put on the court, essentially the Democrats had no voice. They couldn't stop the nomination. They couldn't shape the nomination. They couldn't really question the nomination. Then you're well aware in 2018 of the controversy over the nomination and confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh, which in a sense further politicized the court. There were serious questions about the confirmation. Those questions were aired in the Judiciary Committee hearing. But again, the Democrats had no means to really prevent him from being confirmed to the court. What makes Amy Coney Barrett's selection so unusual, it is by far the latest time in a president's term that a justice was confirmed for the court. There were people voting in many states around the country already. There was going to be an election for that presidential seat and also for control of the Senate. And so what they did is they made sure that Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation occurred before the election happened, which means now you have 6 conservatives on the court to 3 liberals. And that's going to change everything that we know about what the court is going to be. Now, hopefully you see on my screen, this is an array of where the court was ideologically in 2019. Now, you'll notice Ruth Bader Ginsburg is still there. But this gives you a sense of the court is not uniform in the way they hear and decide cases. And the conservatives are not uniform in the way they decide cases. This continuum is based on something called the Martin-Quinn scores. It's a statistical method that judicial behavioralists use to determine the ideological orientation of the Supreme Court justices. And what these scholars do is they look at all the decisions by a court in a particular term, and they ask whether or not the court was upholding the lower court opinion or whether it was overturning the lower court opinion. And they chart what is the percentage of time that you are voting in more conservative direction? What is the percentage of the time that you are voting in a more liberal direction? I was quite surprised that the most liberal member on the court is Sonia Sotomayor. I would have thought it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but she's far more liberal than what Ruth Bader Ginsburg was. I was also surprised that Stephen Breyer, who I knew to be a more moderate liberal, was in fact not more moderate than Elena Kagan, who has done a nice job from time to time about reaching out to John Roberts and the other conservatives on the court to try to get a coalition of votes there. All they're trying to do is get to 5. And the key to understanding the court, dating from now all the way back to 1974, we are talking about 46 years, is that you just had to look at how many liberals were there in a block, how many conservatives were there in a block, and who was in the middle. With the exception of about 3 years in that period, the answer was almost always 4-1-4. 4 liberals, 4 conservatives, and somebody in the middle. You can call that person the tipping court justice. You can call that person the pivotal justice. Many people call that person the swing justice because sometimes they go with the liberals, sometimes with the conservatives. Justices hate to be called that because it makes it seem like they're changing their view and mind, and they're not. But I'm going to call it the median justice. It's the justice in the middle. And so I teach my students, if you are looking at a case from 1974 to 1986, just look at Lewis Powell, a conservative put on the court by Richard Nixon. He, in fact, sometimes voted with the liberals, sometimes with the conservatives. And once he leaves the court in 1987, you watch the court for a period of time jockey around about who will be in the middle. And eventually, it's going to be Sandra Day O'Connor. And if you look at the court from 1994, sometimes you can go back to 1992 in some issue areas, all the way up to 2006. If you know where O'Connor is, you know where the court is going. What she says happens. When she leaves the court in 2006, it becomes Anthony Kennedy. As they change, the middle of the court becomes more liberal. More conservative. O'Connor was more conservative than Powell. Kennedy was more conservative than O'Connor. So when I show you in the middle of this court at zero, at median, it is John Roberts, the Chief Justice. There are two things that are important about this. One, this is the first time since the late 1930s that a chief is the center of the court. That was Charles Evans Hughes in the court packing period of 1937. But Hughes was only there for a year or two. Roberts was set up for a long-term center of the court. It meant he controlled the court. As the chief, he assigns the writer of the majority opinion, and his vote became the majority opinion. He was in the majority last term 100% of the time. But also, this is true. Roberts essentially has made the court a little bit more conservative than it was even under Kennedy. So Roberts was realizing, I think, that his court was politicized, and he was trying to make some decisions that would help the political image of the court, voting for the Affordable Care Act and voting on behalf of same-sex issues. But on the other time, what he's doing is becoming the conservative that he actually is. Now, when you look at this court, you can see that what it has done on the conservative side is it is fractured. On the far right, you have Clarence Thomas. Somewhat in the middle on the far right is going to be Samuel Alito. And as it happens, the two new Trump justices before Barrett, Brett Kavanaugh right here and Neil Gorsuch right here, they have been fairly close to Roberts, and they've been finding ways to agree with him from time to time. In fact, the recent decision upholding transgendered rights and same-sex rights when you are fired, and is that discrimination, and the holding that it is discrimination on the basis of sex, was written by Neil Gorsuch, to many people's surprise. So where I would leave you is this. Where is Amy Coney Barrett going to fall? There are people who believe that she is an ultra-conservative, that she will be somewhere over here between Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas. She is of the opinion that precedents are there to be overturned if her originalism view makes her do that. She says that whatever Scalia was, that's what she's going to be. But in her nomination hearing, she then said, well, you're not going to get Justice Scalia, you're going to get Justice Barrett. We just haven't seen how she's going to decide cases yet. So if it were Scalia, he would be over here to Alito's left shoulder. He would be a little more to the center than where Clarence Thomas is. Or will she be persuaded perhaps by Chief Justice John Roberts that she should stay somewhere in the middle along with the other two originalists? Will she find a way to stay in the middle so that maybe what can happen is not a court tipping far to the right, much more conservative? That's what the conventional wisdom is. But maybe if she stays in the center, they can find a way to pick up Stephen Breyer and Elena Kagan, and you can find 5 or 6 justices in the center who might be able to hold the center of the court and keep it from losing its public support over time. The other thing to watch, and this is the final point, is to keep an eye on the commission that President-elect Biden has said he will form about judicial reform. There's a lot of discussion about what can be done, since what the conservatives have done, the Republicans have done, they've already packed the court. They've successfully packed the court. They've been able to put Amy Coney Barrett on the court. They've been able to tip it far to the right. And so there are people who are advocating, well, maybe what we should do is expand the size of the court because that is a power that Congress has. There are other people who are saying, no, what we should do is limit the tenure of a justice's service from life tenure to maybe 18 years. Very debatable suggestion. I read the Constitution as saying, if you want to change life tenure, you've got to have an amendment. But there are scholars, serious scholars, who say, no, there's a way around it. You can legally change the nature of the service of the justice. You can say you will be a justice for the remainder of your life, but you may not necessarily be in that seat. So I would be watching for this commission to see who's on it, what their recommendations are. And then I would understand that if the Georgia Senate seats leave control of the Senate in Mitch McConnell's hands, there will be almost nothing that President-elect Biden can do. McConnell will be able to dictate to President Biden, here are the people I want on the court, and if I don't get what I want, I will not let you get them. That is the consequence of the change they have made in the filibuster rule and the voting rule. If you have a Senate controlled by the opposite party, it's almost impossible to fill seats on the court. And it may be almost impossible to fill seats on the lower court as well. That's something else that will be going on. So it's going to be very, very difficult if the Republicans keep control of the Senate after the runoff elections, the two of them in Georgia. But if the Democrats are able to get back to 50, and if Kamala Harris is able to cast the tie-breaking vote, then it may be possible for President Biden to be able to fill seats, to be able to fill the lower federal court, and it may be possible to maybe suggest some reforms that will somehow depoliticize the court and take it out of the line of fire. These are indeed very interesting times for studying the court. Thank you very much.